The glass doors of the First National Bank hissed, shut behind Arthur Milligan, cutting off the hum of midday traffic and leaving him in the cool, quiet sanctuary of the bank's lobby. The air smelled of lemons, scented polish and old money, a familiar scent that, for decades, had meant stability and order. At 87, Arthur clung to routine the way a sailor clings to a life raft in a churning sea. It was the structure that kept the fog of age and forgotten years at bay. Today was pension day, a ritual as sacred as any he'd ever known. His body moved with the careful, deliberate slowness of a man navigating a world that had become increasingly fragile. Each step was a conscious effort, his weight shifting from his cane to his left leg, a leg that still ached with a phantom cold from a Korean winter 70 years past. He was dressed not in the finery of a war hero, but in the uniform of a simple, proud old man, a brown corduroy jacket worn soft at the elbows, a simple plaid shirt, and trousers that were clean but had long ago lost their sharp crease. In his gnarled, knotted hand, he clutched a faded blue bank book, the leather cover soft as velvet from years of handling. He took his place at the back of the line, offering a small, vague smile to the woman in front of him. She smiled back briefly before turning away, absorbed in her phone. Arthur didn't mind. He was used to being part of the background, a piece of the scenery in his own town. He let his eyes wander, taking in the high, ornate ceiling, the dark wood of the teller's counters, the digital ticker displaying stock quotes, a language he no longer understood. His gaze eventually settled on the young security guard, pacing slowly near the entrance. The guard, whose name tag read Leo, was new. Arthur could tell by the stiff, self-important set of his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly darted around the room, looking for a threat to justify his presence. Leo was maybe 20, his face still smooth with youth, his uniform crisp and unyielding. He represented a new world, one of constant vigilance and instant suspicion. Arthur's journey to the front of the line felt long. His hip protested the standing, but he would never have considered asking for a chair. He had endured far worse. Finally, it was his turn. He shuffled towards teller number 3, where Sarah Jenkins greeted him with a warm, genuine smile. Sarah had been a girl when Arthur first started coming here. Now she was a woman with children of her own, and she always had a kind word for him. "Good morning, Mr. Milligan," she said, her voice cheerful. "Pension day? Yes, thank you, Sarah," Arthur replied, his voice a dry rustle. He slid the blue bank book and a withdrawal slip across the cool marble counter. "I'd like to withdraw $300, please." "Of course," Sarah said, taking the book. Her fingers danced across her keyboard, inputting the long, memorized account number, the system word, then the cheerful clack of her typing stopped. She frowned, typed the number again, more deliberately this time. The screen flashed a prompt. Then it flashed again, this time with a stark, red banner. Sarah's smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. She leaned closer to the screen, as if proximity could change what it said. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her eyes flicking from the screen to Arthur's face and back. "But the system, it's flagging your account, it says." She lowered her voice to a concerned whisper. "It says this account holder is listed as deceased." The word hung in the air between them, absurd and terrifying. Asterisk deceased asterisk. Arthur's brow furrowed, the deep wrinkles on his forehead carving deeper grooves. He gave a small, shaky laugh, a sound without any humor. "Deceased, no, that can't be right, Sarah. I'm right here. There must be some mistake." The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Leo, the young guard, had been watching. The sight of the teller's frown, the old man's confusion. It was the exact scenario his training videos had outlined. Potential fraud, identity theft. He was at the counter in 3 long strides, his presence suddenly large and intimidating. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" Leo asked, his voice louder than necessary, cutting through the quiet murmur of the bank. Before Sarah could formulate a response that wouldn't cause a scene, Leo peered at the monitor. His eyes locked onto the red deceased flag. That was all the confirmation he needed. His training kicked in. This was a classic case. They preyed on the accounts of the dead, these scammers, often disguising themselves as harmless elderly to avoid suspicion. "Sir," Leo said, his tone dropping into an officious, confrontational register. He stepped between Arthur and the counter, forcing the old man to take a half step back. "I'm going to need you to step away from the counter right now." The color drained from Arthur's face. "But this is my account," he insisted, his voice gaining a thin, reedy quality of panic. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for his wallet. "I have my ID. See, Arthur Milligan. These stories are getting old." Leo scoffed, his voice ringing through the lobby. Every customer was now staring, their transactions forgotten. They saw a loud, aggressive guard and a shabby, flustered old man. The narrative wrote itself. "We know this scam, using a dead person's identity. It's pathetic." He leaned in, jabbing a finger towards the door. "You are fake. Now I won't ask you again. Leave the premises before I call the police and have you arrested for fraud." The words, "you are fake," were a physical blow. They didn't just accuse him of a crime, they negated his very existence, his entire life's history. The proud straightness that military discipline had drilled into his spine finally collapsed. He seemed to shrink inside his worn jacket, becoming smaller and more fragile. His hands trembled as he finally managed to pull out a small, tattered military ID card, the photo from a lifetime ago. He held it out, a silent, desperate plea, his eyes glistening with a humiliation he hadn't felt in decades. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible, "I'm not fake." The battle for his dignity, a battle he thought he'd left behind in a foreign land, had just begun on the polished marble floor of his hometown bank. The word "fake" seemed to hang in the air, a toxic cloud that poisoned the entire atmosphere of the bank. For a moment there was only a ringing silence, broken by the soft, mechanical whir of a counting machine in the back office and the faint, tinny sound of music from a customer's forgotten earphone. Arthur Milligan stood frozen, the tattered military ID card in his outstretched hand, trembling like a leaf in a storm. The accusation had not just been heard, it had been felt, a visceral blow that struck at the very core of his identity. He was no longer a man, but a problem, a suspect, a fiction. Leo, the security guard, stood his ground, his chest puffed out with the grim satisfaction of having confronted a threat. He saw the old man's trembling not as a sign of distress, but as confirmation of guilt, the nervous shakes of a con artist caught in the act. He made no move to look at the proffered ID card. In his mind, its authenticity was a foregone conclusion, 0. It was all part of the performance. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again," Leo repeated, his voice hardening, losing the last vestiges of professional neutrality and becoming pure, unadulterated threat. He reached out, not to take the ID, but to grasp Arthur's arm just above the elbow. The touch was firm, impersonal, the grip of an authority figure escorting a trespasser. "You need to leave, now." A small, pained sound escaped Arthur's lips. The physical contact, so rough and dismissive, was a final, crushing indignity. The memories it triggered were not of bank lines and tellers, but of a different kind of confrontation, of being handled, of being a prisoner. His eyes, wide with shock and humiliation, glistened with unshed tears. He was a combat medic who had stared down artillery barrages, but this public shaming, this erasure of his self, was a terror of a different kind. Across the counter, Sarah Jenkins felt her own heart hammering against her ribs. Her face was flushed with a mixture of horror and fury. She knew Arthur. She knew he brought in a small, carefully wrapped box of home-made fudge every Christmas for the bank staff. She knew he called everyone ma'am or sir, with an old-world courtesy that was vanishing from the world. She knew the story, whispered by her own grandfather, of how Arthur Milligan had carried wounded boys through the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. A story that belonged in history books, not being debased in a line at a bank. "Leo, wait," Sarah said, her voice tight but forceful. "This is a mistake. I know, Mr. Milligan. The computer doesn't lie, Sarah." Leo shot back, not even looking at her, his gaze fixed on the task of removing the problem from the premises. He began to gently, but insistently, pull Arthur away from the counter. The other customers watched, a gallery of silent, uncomfortable witnesses. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared, captivated by the drama. None intervened. This was the moment Sarah's paralysis broke. Seeing Arthur, this gentle, proud man, being manhandled, his quiet dignity stripped away, ignited a fierce, protective courage in her. She remembered with sudden, crystalline clarity a day 3 years prior. Arthur had come in to update his emergency contact information. His wife had passed, he'd explained softly, and there was no family left. He'd slid a deposit slip across the counter to her. On it, in his shaky, old-fashioned script, was a name and a phone number. My friend, Admiral James Wright. Arthur had said, a touch of pride in his voice. He's a busy man, but he always says if I ever need anything, for any reason, I should call. He's like a brother. Sarah had filed the slip away in the bank's system, never thinking she would need it. Now, as Leo pulled a resistant, bewildered Arthur towards the door, Sarah acted. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the client notes. There it was. Asterisk emergency contact, Admiral James Wright. Asterisk without a second thought, she grabbed the phone at her station, her back turned to Leo and the unfolding scene. Her hands were shaking so badly she misdialed the first time. She took a sharp breath, steadied herself, and tried again. The line was picked up on the first ring, right here. The voice on the other end was not just loud, it was sharp, authoritative, and crackling with an energy that brooked no nonsense. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command, to being heard, and to immediate action. Admiral Wright. Sarah whispered, her hand cupped tightly around the receiver. This is Sarah Jenkins at the First National Bank. There's a terrible situation with Mr. Milligan, Arthur Milligan. There was no hesitation, only a shift in the quality of the silence on the line, becoming charged and dangerous. What kind of situation? They're accusing him of fraud. Sarah rushed out, her words tumbling over one another. The system flagged his account as deceased. The security guard won't let him leave. He's being horrible to him. He's calling him a fake and is threatening to call the police. Where is Arthur now? The Admiral's voice was like a blade being sharpened. The guard is trying to physically escort him out of the building. He's humiliating him in front of everyone. Listen to me very carefully. The Admiral said, each word a clipped, precise order. You tell that guard that if he so much as lays another finger on Arthur, he will answer directly to me. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Sarah breathed. I am 5 minutes away. Do not let Arthur leave. The line went dead with a definitive click. Sarah turned, her heart in her throat. Leo had managed to get Arthur about 10 feet from the door. The old man was moving reluctantly, his cane scraping against the floor, his head bowed in defeat. Sir, Sarah called out, her voice stronger now, fortified by the authority she had just channeled. Leo, wait. Leo paused, turning a look of pure annoyance towards her. What now, Sarah? That was his friend. He's on his way. He's an admiral, he asked. He demanded asterisk. That you wait and that you not touch Mr. Milligan. For a second, Leo just stared at her. Then a short, derisive laugh burst from his lips. It was a harsh, ugly sound in the tense quiet of the bank. An Admiral, right, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. He shook his head, his grip tightening slightly on Arthur's arm. A nice try. It's probably his partner in crime, coming to bail him out. That's how these scams work. He resumed his march towards the door, now more determined than ever to complete his mission before this fictional admiral could arrive and complicate things. He saw himself as the only sane man in the room, the lone defender against a coordinated criminal plot. He didn't see the tragedy unfolding in the stooped shoulders of the old man he was pushing towards the street. He only saw a case number, a potential write-up in his log, a problem to be solved. Clock was ticking, and the real storm, one wearing the uniform of the United States Navy, was already en route, moving with the unstoppable force of a man coming to the defense of his brother in arms. The tension in the bank had reached a fever pitch. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of silence, broken only by the ragged sound of Arthur Milligan's breathing and the determined scrape of his cane as Leo pulled him towards the exit. The other customers were statues, their own mundane banking errands completely forgotten. They were an audience to a profound injustice, yet frozen by the unsettling authority of the security guard and the bizarre nature of the accusation. The air was charged with a terrible, voyeuristic energy. Arthur's mind had retreated. The polished marble floor beneath his feet dissolved into the frozen, unforgiving ground of a Korean hillside. Leo's grip on his arm was no longer that of an overzealous guard. It was the impersonal, bruising hand of a captor from a long-ago nightmare. He was no longer in a bank. He was being dragged from a makeshift aid station, the cries of the wounded men he'd failed to save echoing in his ears. His free hand, the one holding the cane, clenched into a white-knuckled fist, not in anger, but in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to hold onto a shred of his dignity. He was a ghost, a specter being exorcised from the world of the living, just as the computer had declared. Leo, for his part, felt a surge of self-righteous conviction. Sarah's desperate plea about an admiral only confirmed his suspicions. It was a classic distraction tactic, a Hail Mary pass from a flustered accomplice. He tightened his grip, his jaw set. He would be the one who stopped this fraud, who protected the bank's assets. He would be commended. He gave Arthur one more firm tug, his voice a low, impatient growl. "Almost out, old man. Don't make this harder than it has to be." It was in that exact moment that the universe shifted. The bank's automatic doors did not simply slide open, they were assaulted. They flew inward with a violent, shuddering asterisk bang asterisk that made everyone in the lobby jump, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet hall. Framed in the sudden rectangle of blinding daylight was a figure that seemed too large, too imposing, to be real. Standing, there was a tall, broad-shouldered man in the crisp, dark blue service dress uniform of a United States Navy admiral. The uniform was a map of his service. Ribbons of every color adorned his left breast, gold braid gleamed on his sleeves and shoulders, and the stars on his epaulets seemed to catch the light like cold, hard diamonds. His face was a landscape of grim, weathered authority, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's focus until they locked onto the scene at the center. The young guard manhandling the shrunken, defeated form of Arthur Milligan. The silence that followed was deeper and more profound than before. You could hear the faint electric hum of the fluorescent lights, the rustle of a receipt being crumpled in a nervous hand. The admiral did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was a command in itself. He strode into the bank, his footsteps, the hard, precise heel, strike of a man who has spent a lifetime on the decks of warship, echoing with terrifying clarity on the marble floor. Each step was a measured beat of impending judgment. He ignored everyone, the gawking customers, the petrified bank manager who had just emerged from his office, the terrified Sarah. His gaze was fixed solely on his friend. He walked right up to them, his shadow falling over both Leo and Arthur. Leo had frozen completely, his hand still clamped on Arthur's arm, his mouth slightly agape. The sight of the uniform, the sheer, undeniable power radiating from the man wearing it, had short-circuited his brain. This was no accomplice. This was a force of nature. The admiral's eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at Arthur. He placed a steadying, gentle hand on his old friend's shoulder. "At ease, Sergeant?" he said, his voice low and surprisingly soft, a harbor in the storm for Arthur alone. The effect was instantaneous. A shudder ran through Arthur's body, and some of the terrible tension drained from his frame. He was no longer alone. Then the admiral turned his attention to Leo. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes, which had been a refuge for Arthur, became cold, hard flint, boring into the young guard. "Admiral James Wright, United States Navy," he announced, his voice no longer soft but a clarion call that filled every corner of the vast room. It was not an introduction. It was a statement of jurisdiction. "Explain to me why you are assaulting a decorated war hero." Leo's mouth worked, but no sound came out. His hand fell away from Arthur's arm as if the limb had been electrocuted. He stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. compared to the Admiral's resonant baritone. "Sir, the system, it said he was deceased. It's a fraud alert. I was just doing my job. Deceased." The Admiral did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet, controlled tone was more terrifying than any shout. It was laced with a scathing, volcanic contempt. "The only thing deceased around here, son, is your common sense." He shifted his gaze to the bank manager, who was visibly trembling, clutching a pen as if it were a lifeline. "You," the Admiral said, the single word carrying the weight of a verdict. He pointed a finger at the manager. "You will listen, and you will listen well." He then turned back to the entire lobby, his voice projecting so every single person, every silent witness, could hear the truth. "This man," he said, his hand returning to Arthur's shoulder, "is Arthur Milligan. He was a combat medic, a sergeant with the 7th Infantry Division in Korea." He paused, letting the words sink in. "During the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, when the temperature dropped to 30 below zero and the Chinese army surrounded us, our command post was overrun. We were ordered to retreat, but Sergeant Milligan refused a direct order to leave the wounded." The Admiral's voice grew thicker, the memory raw even after 70 years. "He carried 12 wounded men, one by one, through a blizzard under constant enemy fire. He used his own body to shield them. He spent 6 weeks behind enemy lines, evading capture, keeping those boys alive with little more than snow and sheer will. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, listed it as missing in action, presumed dead. They got it wrong then." He now glared directly at the bank manager, his eyes blazing. "And your pathetic, soulless computer has gotten it wrong now." He gently took Arthur's left hand and held it up for all to see, revealing the 2 missing fingers, the stunted reminders of the frostbite that had nearly killed him. "He paid for his courage with his blood and with his flesh, and you—" His sweeping gaze took in Leo, the manager, the very institution itself. "You dare to call him a fake. You dare to lay hands on him." The Admiral leaned in close to the manager, his final words dropping to a deadly whisper that was somehow more powerful than his shout. "You will fix his account. You will apologize, and you," he said, turning his head back towards a pale and utterly broken Leo, "will learn that a man's worth is not in a database entry. It is in his deeds, and this man's deeds are worth more than this entire building." The Admiral's words did not simply fade away. They settled over the bank lobby like a judgment, heavy and absolute. The silence that followed was no longer tense with anticipation, but thick with shame and awe. The bank manager, a man named Mr. Higgins, who had spent his life worrying about interest rates and overdraft fees, looked as if he had been physically struck by the weight of history. He stared at Arthur Milligan, not as a problem to be solved, but as a living monument he had just helped desecrate. "Admiral, sir, Mr. Milligan, my most profound, my most sincere apologies," Mr. Higgins stammered, his voice trembling. "This is a catastrophic failure on our part. Please, please, come with me to my office. We will rectify this immediately." His demeanor was no longer that of a manager, but of a supplicant. Admiral Wright gave a short, sharp nod, his hand still resting protectively on Arthur's shoulder. He guided his friend, who was still moving in a daze of shock and relief, towards the plush confines of the manager's office. As they passed Leo, the young guard did not meet their eyes. He stood rooted to the spot, a statue of humiliation, his face ashen. The crisp authority of his uniform now felt like a costume, the badge on his chest a mark of his own profound failure. He had not seen a hero, he had only seen a suspect. The Admiral's words, "The only thing deceased is your common sense," played on a loop in his mind, each repetition a fresh lash. Inside the manager's office, the resolution was swift and servile. With a few furious keystrokes, Mr. Higgins reinstated the account, removed the erroneous deceased flag, and personally handed Arthur an envelope containing his $300, along with a waiver for all future banking fees. "It's the very least we can do, Mr. Milligan, the very least," he kept repeating, his hands fluttering nervously, but Arthur seemed barely to notice. The money, the apology, they were abstractions. He was looking at his friend, James. The terrifying force of nature who had stormed the bank had vanished, replaced by the young ensign whose life Arthur had saved all those years ago. "You came, James," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll always come, Arthur," the Admiral replied, his own voice softening. "You should have called me yourself." "I didn't want to be a bother," Arthur whispered, and in that simple, heartbreaking sentence, the Admiral understood the depth of his friend's lonely pride. As they stepped out of the office, the main lobby had mostly returned to normal, though a hushed reverence lingered in the air. Customers glanced at Arthur with new, respectful eyes, and then the Admiral's gaze fell upon Leo. The young guard was still standing by the door, looking utterly lost, a boy who had tried to play a man's role and failed spectacularly. The anger in the Admiral's chest, once a white, hot flame, now cooled into something else, a sense of responsibility. Punishing the boy would be easy. Fixing him would be the real mission. "Guard," the Admiral called, his voice firm but no longer explosive. Leo flinched as if struck. He slowly, reluctantly approached, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Sir," he mumbled, I don't know what to say. I am so sorry. I was just doing my job." The excuse sounded hollow even to him. The job. The Admiral corrected him, his tone that of a teacher delivering a vital lesson, is not just to protect property. It is to protect people, their safety, their dignity, especially the dignity of those who have already given so much of themselves to protect you. He looked from Leo's ashamed face to Arthur's weary one. An idea, a perfect and redemptive symmetry, began to form in his mind. "Arthur," the Admiral said, turning to his friend, "this young man owes you a debt, and he's going to pay it, but not with money. He's going to pay it with time, with attention." He then laid out his plan, the final, surprising twist that would transform this story of humiliation into one of healing. The Admiral, who sat on the board of the local Veterans Outreach Foundation, arranged for Leo to enroll in a new community program. It wasn't a punishment, it was an education. His sentence was to volunteer 20 hours a week as a driver and assistant for elderly veterans, many of whom lived in isolated loneliness, just like Arthur. At first, Leo approached it as a chore, a penance to be endured. His first assignment was to drive a veteran named Frank to his physical therapy appointments. He was quiet, efficient, and distant. But Frank, a talkative Marine who had fought in Vietnam, wouldn't allow the silence. He asked Leo about his life, his ambitions. Slowly, reluctantly, Leo began to talk. The next week, he helped another veteran, a woman named Evelyn, who had served as a nurse in the Gulf War, with her grocery shopping. He carried her bags, and she told him stories of field hospitals under the desert stars. He started to see the maps of their lives in the wrinkles on their faces, the pride in their postures, the quiet struggles they never complained about. And he spent time with Arthur, not as a guard but as a companion. He helped him tidy his small garden, and Arthur, in his quiet way, showed him the 2 frostbitten stumps on his hand. "Lost these to the cold," he said simply. A small price to pay. In that moment, Leo finally saw it. Not a disfigurement, but a badge of honor. He was no longer looking at an old man in a worn jacket. He was in the presence of the medic from the Admiral's story, a giant of courage and sacrifice. Weeks turned into a month. The sullen, suspicious guard was slowly being sanded away, revealing a more thoughtful, empathetic young man beneath. He wasn't just driving them to appointments, he was listening. He was learning. He was beginning to understand that the uniform he had been so proud of was just cloth, while the character of the men and women he now served was forged in steel. The story that had begun with an angry admiral and a shattered old man was ending with a simple, powerful act of kindness, the gift of understanding, passed from one generation to another, healing both in the process.